Thank you. I have the perfect transition. I just said that because there is also a linguistic connection between the first panel and the second panel. We heard just some words about infinite jest. Our next speaker is Paul Scherz, but in German it is Scherz, and it may be also an infinite jest. Paul Scherz is the Associate Professor of Moral Theology and Ethics in the School of Theology and Religious Studies at the Catholic University of America. He is one rare exception of holding a PhD in genetics and a PhD in moral theology from Harvard and from Notre Dame. He researches the moral theology of biotechnology and medical practice, uses the work of Alistair MacIntyre and Michel Foucault to examine how the daily use of biomedical technologies shapes the way researchers, doctors, and patients see and manipulate the world and their bodies. His scholarly interests include the Ars Moriendi, but he is currently working on a book with the title Science as Vocation in an Entrepreneurial Age, Truth, Community, and Spiritual Exercises. I will be a little bit strict with the time because we have gone beyond a little bit, so 20 minutes papers and then 1 or 2 questions, but so that we have also some discussion after the panel, or with the panel after the lectures. With that, Paul, yours.
Thank you for that introduction, and thank you all for being here. In our cultural imagination, our genes are intimately tied to our identity. This is correct in a way. Our genetic heritage forms part of the material, bodily aspect of the human person. Exactly how we relate genes to personhood has often been problematic, though. For a long time, it was thought that genes rigidly determined our characteristics, fating certain traits or behaviors. This model of the relationship between genes and identity affected action and policies. Under a determinist model, the only way to control a less than ideal genetic heritage had been the selection of future people at the point of reproduction, either through sterilization of selected unfit individuals in the population or the elimination of unfit children. Today, though, we are witnessing the establishment of a new relationship between genetics and human identity, one radically different from this older form of genetic determinism. Instead of an ironclad determination of our future, our genetic heritage is now understood as putting us at risk for various ailments and traits, as Dr. Novembre suggested. With enough knowledge, however, knowledge provided by growing levels of self-surveillance, we think we can manage these risks through the increasingly intensive interventions of precision medicine. Yet this does not mean that the determinist paradigm has gone away. It remains, but only in certain areas, such as reproductive planning or certain dread diseases. In my talk today, I'm going to outline the causes of the shift between these two modes of engaging genetic identity, as well as their ethical problems. I'll argue that while deterministic frameworks create clear challenges to human dignity through their eugenic tendencies towards the selection of certain individuals to live or die, the surveillance framework raises its own dangers in terms of power and our understanding of human finitude. The idea that our characteristics are determined by our physical inheritance is very old. One finds it in defenses of aristocratic bloodlines, but even in philosophical form in Plato's and Aristotle's political works. Yet the idea of transforming society by managing inheritance only took on its scientific form in the 19th century with the rise of Darwinism, which suggests that some physical inheritances made an individual unfit for the environment. Social commentators swiftly started to extend this paradigm beyond merely physical traits to suggest that mental and moral traits were also heritable. Cesare Lombroso described criminality as the result of certain genetic inheritances and atavisms, for example. Others started recording genealogies of families to show that poverty, lack of intelligence, and loose morals ran in families, studies that became popular books. This determinism took a racist cast as it sought to paint certain ethnic groups, particularly Northern Europeans, as superior to others. This research was used to support eugenic social interventions. The eugenicists feared that modern medicine and social insurance schemes were preventing the operation of the mechanism of natural selection, allowing more and more feeble-minded, criminal, and morally perverse individuals to be born, grow to maturity, and reproduce. As these trends increased in the future, eugenicists predicted that society would be overwhelmed with the unfit, collapsing under the weight of its own beneficence. To prevent this accelerating collapse of society, these theorists argued that the only solution was to replace the natural selection that no longer operated in human society with artificial selection. These commitments led to harshly coercive eugenic legislation that selected those determined to be mentally and socially unfit to be forcibly sterilized. These eugenic activities did meet opposition from religious opponents committed to free will, human dignity, and biblical understanding of the body and sexuality. Moreover, many scientists saw that eugenics was bad science, based in outmoded theories, poor instruments, and biased observers. Still, tens of thousands of people were sterilized in this country. It was finally undone by public outrage at Nazism, although eugenic sterilizations continued into the 1970s. Even though this movement eventually was displaced, a more scientifically accurate way of understanding genetic determinism arose as Mendelian genetics developed. Genetics discovered a range of diseases that were determined by genetic inheritance: hemophilia, sickle cell anemia, metabolic diseases, Huntington's disease, by tracing them to individual mutations in individual genes. As a result of such developments, the theory took hold, at least at the popular level, that every trait had some kind of genetic equivalent. In the 1980s and 1990s, this model led to researchers claiming that they had discovered individual genes or chromosomal abnormalities coding for a whole host of social and behavioral traits, like violence linked to having 2 Y chromosomes, or a gene for homosexuality. These findings generally overstated correlations and relied on poor statistics. Still, such studies led to a picture of the person's health, character, and abilities as primarily determined by her individual genes. Most of these paradigmatic traits were unchangeable, cast in stone. If you have a gene variant for Huntington's disease or cystic fibrosis, you will have that disease. Thus, the only intervention was still selection. This selection occurred differently than in the earlier eugenics, though, by taking a non-coercive approach. The goal was for individuals to select against disease genes through their autonomous choices. Most commonly, this project proceeds through selection against the whole person possessing the unwanted gene variant. Prenatal or even pre-implantation genetic testing allow medical staff to identify those lives deemed not worth living, and they are eliminated. Since all of this occurs through the choice of the individual parents, there is no overt coercive pressure from the state. Thus, it's a liberal eugenics. Of course, this description ignores the subtle pressures of medical staff, social ideals, economic pressures on parents, as well as the actual destruction of a person with a disability, deemed unworthy of living. In this mechanism of selection, we find the practical implementation of the widespread belief in genetic determinism. It is a doctrine that sees our genes as inevitably determining our traits, including some of our most important characteristics. In this view, genes assume an almost mystic quality. For example, many secular scientists and politicians lionize the Human Genome Project as providing the book of life. This description must strike a theologian as problematic, since what was previously understood to be written in the book of life was our eternal destiny. Instead, our destiny seemed determined by genes. The application of this view leads to selection processes that choose people to fit social ideals, ideals which are always arbitrary when compared to the dignity inhering in the image of God that each person possesses. When this deterministic view of genetic fate spreads from mere disease to other characteristics, it threatens to take away human freedom and expand the sphere of expert control. It was to realize this hope and end that, in part, the Human Genome Project was directed. It sought to give us the key, not only to disease, but to many other aspects of the human. It was hoped and feared that the Genome Project would fulfill the determinist vision. Then a funny thing happened. The genome was sequenced, and everything turned out to be much more complicated than it first appeared. When the Genome Project started, researchers estimated that humans would have something like 100,000 genes. How else are you going to account for all the traits? They found that we actually have only around 19 to 22,000 genes. At the time, I was an undergraduate researcher in a genetics lab, and I remember the shock that many researchers felt when these initial findings were announced. This is the same number of genes as the nematode worm, C. elegans, meaning that humans achieve immensely more complexity and capability with approximately the same number of genes as a worm. Thus, there can't be any one-to-one gene-trait correspondence. Instead, much depends on how these genes are regulated and how they interact, meaning that there is a lot of flexibility in how the genome determines our traits. Of course, there are many in the field of genetics to whom this finding wasn't a surprise. Geneticists have long known that for many traits, a certain genotype does not lead invariably to a phenotype, a phenomenon known as incomplete penetrance. It has long been known that many traits are caused by the interaction of a number of genes, or pleiotropy. It has also long been known that environmental factors influence traits, and even gene expression through epigenetic mechanisms. What was new was that developments pushed this knowledge from the fringes of the field to the center. These phenomena ceased to be interesting but minor exceptions to a largely determinist picture and became central to our understanding of genetics. These trends were complemented by developments occurring outside of genetics in a new medical paradigm. Driven by the success of epidemiological studies like the Framingham Heart Study, medicine began to focus on risk factors for disease, such as high blood pressure and blood cholesterol levels for heart disease, smoking for lung cancer, or obesity for almost everything. These conditions are not themselves disease, but they increase the statistical probability of becoming ill. They do not deterministically cause illness. We all know of people like my grandmother, who smoked, cooked with bacon fat, and subsisted seemingly largely on jelly beans for the last 15 years of her life, yet lived with little illness or mental impairment until she rapidly declined after a fall at age 92. There are always people who will fall on the lucky tail of the statistical curve. Yet given the importance of this paradigm in medicine, genes began to be thought of along the lines of these risk factors. They predispose one to certain diseases. As geneticists discovered that not many genes caused a major predisposition to disease, they started to look for smaller increases in risk, or combinations of genes that were risk factors, as we heard earlier. A second movement, entirely outside of medicine and biomedical sciences, impacted this new understanding of genetics. As Gaiman discussed earlier, for 20 years now, tech companies have sought to design algorithms that sweep up the massive amounts of information provided on the internet and use it to sell products, tailor searches, ads, etc. These algorithms are based on statistical correlations revealed by large data sets. Since the Genome Project, such an approach has been central to genetics because the genome is such a massive data set. At a very early stage, genome centers and genetics labs began recruiting programmers and bioinformatics specialists who were trained in the tech industry's big data paradigm to help them interpret genomic information. This overlap is becoming even greater as many tech companies move into the healthcare field, directly providing analytics and wearable health devices. This is moving ahead rapidly. Even since I wrote this talk a couple of weeks ago, Google bought Fitbit, and we discovered that they have access to all the health data provided of a major Catholic medical system. This confluence of factors created a new paradigm for genetics, what I think we can call a risk paradigm. So what does this look like in practice? We can see this paradigm in action in a study by the Pioneer 100 Wellness Project. These researchers gathered an incredible amount of data from 108 participants. Their genomes were sequenced, their microbiome sampled. Every 3 months, they had blood tests, which tested for 643 metabolites and 262 proteins each time. They were asked to wear a Fitbit to track activity and sleep. What one discovers is that when monitored at this level of detail, no one is healthy. Everyone was at risk for something. Half were pre-diabetic. Almost no one got enough vitamin D. There were numerous preconditions. One of the participants, a health-conscious venture capitalist who runs triathlons, was surprised to learn he was pre-diabetic. Health disappeared into risk. Luckily, the study provided coaches who suggested interventions to manage these risks, like supplements, medications, even medical procedures. In this new paradigm, people seek intensive knowledge about themselves. Like in a deterministic framework, they need to know their genome sequence. But unlike under determinism, the sequence does not tell you who you are or what your exact future is. Instead, it tells you your risk profile, what to fear, what to keep your eyes on. Again, unlike determinism, genetic knowledge does not lead to action in the form of one-time selection. This fit couple should reproduce, this unfit person should be sterilized. Instead, knowledge of one's genetic heritage demands more knowledge. One must seek to know levels of various metabolites. One must know one's blood pressure, have regular screenings for cancer, analyze what one eats, how much one exercises, how much one sleeps. This knowledge demands constant surveillance. To be human is to be at risk. This paradigm is now affecting everyone. Millions of people have sent their saliva off to 23andMe. Fitbits and other wearable health monitoring devices allow individuals to track all of their metabolic and physical activity, comparing it to an ideal. This paradigm is only set to become more entrenched in science and medicine with the completion of the NIH's rather creepily named All of Us study. This $4.3 billion 10-year effort seeks to enroll 1 million people in a program of genome sequencing connected to their health records. Some of the subgroups will have even more intensive screening components. This effort will provide much more knowledge of the risk factors embedded in our genomes than we currently have. The goal of the program is to make this information available to clinical medicine in the form of precision medicine, to give, as Francis Collins, head of the NIH, says, quote, a considerably more useful estimate of your future risks of illness than is currently possible, enabling a personalized plan of preventive medicine to be established. These efforts are well underway, so the question for us is, should we be concerned by them? Now, there's many positives to this new paradigm, not least of which is that if used correctly, these data should improve health outcomes for specific diseases. Moreover, it is certainly preferable to the determinist paradigm. This new paradigm makes space for human freedom in determining outcomes, for contingency, environment, society, and history. Further, I don't see any of the gross threats to human life that emerge from the determinist paradigm. Yet there are also problems with the risk paradigm. The first is purely practical. In regard to issues of justice, the risk paradigm leads to ongoing and very expensive diagnostic testing. It also leads to expensive interventions to reduce risk, prophylactic surgeries or medication that one must stay on for one's entire life because genetic risk is chronic. Further, it is not clear how effective this paradigm is at lowering overall risk because every intervention raises its own risks. Every surgery or biopsy can lead to complications. Every medication has possible side effects. Paradoxically, the reduction of some risks lead to other risks. Second, the risk paradigm could impact our existential experience of the world. We now know that we are not determined. Instead, though, we are living at risk. If you have read about or discussed the experiences of breast cancer survivors or people testing positive for genetic mutations predisposing them for cancer, then you know that it is not comfortable to live at risk. The person searches for lumps, monitors their bodily sensations, and lives in dread of the results of the next test. These new technologies threaten to expand this way of being from a small subset of the population to all of us, as the research project's title suggests. It is a life of anxiety and distraction, mirroring the lack of security we feel in the rest of our lives in the face of uncertain employment, political turmoil, and unstable families. The broad anxiety that threatens our population. Now, this would not be so bad if the end result was to teach us to number our days and think of our end in all things. Acknowledging mortality teaches us to live a better life and appreciate each moment. It can contribute to flourishing. Yet the risk paradigm does not lead to that way of seeing the world, because these test results are not just a reminder of mortality. They demand a response. Instead of teaching us to rely on God in the face of the world's uncertainties, it suggests that we can keep mortality at bay through increased and better risk management. By so doing, it shapes how we understand our bodies and thus ourselves. Under this paradigm, our bodies are not vital entities with natural teleologies, nor even well-functioning mechanisms, but instead a bundle of risks that we need to manage, a collection of subsystems in various states of disarray that we need to administer. We see this kind of identity emerging in the quantified self movement, which encourages people to engage in this kind of intensive surveillance tied to genome sequencing. This movement promotes the Delphic directive, know thyself, that forms the basis of much philosophy, but for them, knowing yourself means knowing your numbers. For them, this is true self-knowledge. This knowledge of the numbers of the body will likely serve to continue to promote a kind of modern dualism, with genes becoming the source of threat. Not the threat of temptation or corruption, as in older forms of dualism, but threats to physical or mental well-being. The risky body must be controlled and managed. It's not the management of a factory or machine, as in the older dualistic views, not the Fordist assembly line, but more like financial management, in which one must assess risks to one's portfolio, balance risks, and insure against the worst. While this way of being would be a problem at the individual level, my concern is that the imperative this surveillance gives to engage in risk management makes any other response seem irresponsible. This new paradigm is becoming embedded in institutional structures that force people to engage in healthcare as a form of conservative risk management. For example, one can see this impetus in employee wellness programs. These programs try to decrease health spending by encouraging employees to engage in surveillance and consequent lifestyle coaching. Of course, much of what these programs do is beneficial, encouraging people to stop smoking, for example, or exercise. However, these programs are set to expand and intensify in the future. Troublingly, these programs can require genetic testing as part of participation, and a section of one of the recent bills to replace the Affordable Care Act would have allowed them to share these data with employers. Currently, these programs use the carrot of reduced health insurance premiums, up to 30%, to encourage participation. As health insurance premiums continue to rise, the carrot of reduced premiums could quickly become a stick of unaffordable premiums for those who refuse to engage with these programs or who are unresponsive to coaching. This paradigm would then be enforced by institutional sanction. So this is the paradigm emerging from the collapse of the determinist framework. While better in many ways, it still holds many dangers to our understanding of what it means to be human. It reinforces the mechanistic understanding of our bodies while translating it into the language of risk, so that we see ourselves as a bundle of risky subsystems that must be managed. Even worse, it continues to suggest that we can successfully manage our risks so that we can escape the mortality that lies before us. It is incumbent upon us to seek out alternative understandings of the human that will teach us to live in the face of mortality with a knowledge of finitude and respect for our bodies. Ultimately, even the most intensive human surveillance cannot overcome death, but it can lead us to waste the days we have in anxiety. Moreover, those of us who are Christians must ensure that our attempts to ward off our very human mortality do not distract us from our devotion to the person by whom death has already been conquered. Thank you.
I would like to move on, but if you have an urgent question right now, I would take it very shortly. Okay, that is great. Then we will discuss that at the panel at the end. Our next speaker is familiar to everyone who is at the University of Chicago, Willemien Otten, professor of theology and the history of Christianity, also associate faculty in the Department of History, Social Sciences Division here at the University of Chicago. She holds an MA and PhD from the University of Amsterdam, studies the history of Christianity and Christian thought, including the continuity of Platonic themes. I'm trying to shorten it here. She is the co-editor of, forgive me, I can only say it in my way, Eriogena and Creation on Religion and Memory, and the Oxford Guide to the Historical Reception of Augustine. Her most recent project is entitled Natura Educans, the Psychology of Pantheism from Eriogena to Emerson. So, Willemien, yours is the floor.
Thank you. So it's good you mentioned my project Natura Educans, because that has changed, and that is the backdrop for what I'll be talking about. It's now become a book that will come out in a few months called Thinking Nature and the Nature of Thinking, from Eriogena to Emerson. I'll say something about that along the way, but my narrative will be a narrative of the history of Christian thought that I see to some extent underlying the history of the West and Western thought. And I think the Christian dimension of that history has some interesting things to say about this. And I should thank Stephen Meredith, with whom I've had some discussions about this along the way when we were working on something that I think lies at the basis of this conference. So, in Christian thought, humanity is seen as created in the image of God, according to Genesis 1:26-27. That's a very foundational text for theological anthropology. But aside from a definition, it is also a kind of a command, a task to live up to being the image of God, right? That comes out clearly in some thinkers in early Christianity who see the image and likeness idea and the comprehensive notion of both image and likeness more as an eschatological position. The idea being that humanity is created in God's image, but it will acquire likeness only much later on, and conditionally maybe not all would reach that. Origen would seem to think along those lines, and maybe Augustine at points does so too. The presupposition of that thought is that humanity is fallen, is deficient, and therefore it cannot really hang on to that image character of the divine. It must struggle to reach something along the lines of likeness. Of course, the figure of Jesus Christ, and the last speaker ended with that, and I was pleased with that, is the remedy and the antidote to this fall. In Athanasius of Alexandria, probably the most important Christological thinker to this day almost, one would say, the anthropological solution is facilitated by a Christological intervention. The idea for Athanasius would be that while Adam could contemplate the Logos in paradise, because paradise is the backdrop for much of it, while Adam was contemplating the Logos before the fall, humans after Adam are no longer able to do so. And the Logos, of course, would be the Word of God, would be the pre-existent Christ. But, so would Athanasius reason, now we have the incarnate Christ. And through him we have a bond with God still, right? Of course, that ends when Christ ascends to heaven, but Athanasius sees that direct connection with God continued in the organic unity that there is within the church through the sacraments, you can think. So this bond with Christ is restored, and there is a sense of earthly glory. Hence Athanasius' triumphant statement, God became human so that humanity can become deified, can become divine. Right? Athanasius precedes by about half a century, or a little more, Augustine in time. Right? But Augustine is thinking rather differently about the endemically destructive quality of the human through his notion of original sin. It means that any naive idea with sin remedied, humanity can return to paradise is out the window. That is no longer an option for Augustine, who I think, especially in his anti-Pelagian zeal, forces out any possible cyclical view. And I just really want to underscore that, because I think before Augustine, everybody thought of restoration as a kind of return to paradise. But I think that disappears really with Augustine, who sacrifices any sense of a cyclical life cycle, moving life and instead towards a linear pattern, right? So he moves from life as a regressive and perhaps reductive path to sinlessness towards a path that can only lead one forward. And that ideally then leads to some improvement, which he would call sanctification. So linearity is now the norm of human life, and linearity is also projected onto the past. as he sketches the journey from Adam and Eve after leaving Eden as moving towards the Christians of Augustine's own day. And in fact, he has a whole historical set of periods that connect us with Adam and Eve. In Augustine, therefore, and that's the point I want to make, we do have the introduction of temporality in ways that I think we did not see in Athanasius or any other early Christian thinker, as they were generally much more focused on the eschatological as a stage within reach. No longer so for Augustine, with whom it's not the case that modernity has arrived, but it is the case that we see the temporal world laid bare that Kant would much later consider ruled by Anschauungsformen, or forms of perception. I actually think we see that in Augustine. And it's in this temporal scenario that I see the dynamics between nature and human nature on perpetration and victimhood unfold. Clearly, I'm not someone trained in the sciences, but come from the perspective of the history of Christianity and, to some extent, of theology. And it's from those perspectives that I aim to shed some light on the conference's themes. Now, in my own work, again set against the backdrop of a fully temporal worldview, I've been intrigued by thinkers on nature. Of course, thinking about nature when one cannot suspend thinking about the environmental crisis, right? And there's a lot of scholarship these days that goes into thinking about nature in light of the environmental crisis. But in my own work, I felt that I've deliberately wanted to avoid thinking about nature only in crisis mode. I actually feel that that is a confusion of Kantian sort of forms of perception, because crisis mode is then the apocalyptic, and nature has a spatial dimension and is at home in the world. So I think we should not give that up when think about nature. But as I've wanted to move away from thinking about nature only in terms of victimhood, I've also wanted to be more nuanced about humanity as perpetrator. In fact, the dichotomy between victimhood and perpetration is precisely what I think see as the problem. So let me explain my own work on nature a little more, in which I've been concerned, and you may freely disagree with that, to broaden the Christian canon. My authors include, first of all, a medieval author not widely known in the 9th century, John the Scot Eriugena, whose work is entitled On Natures. And I have argued increasingly that I think, in my view, he should be compared to and put on a par with, on the one hand, Origen's Peri Archon on first principles, and on the other hand, Thomas Aquinas' Summa Theologiae. His work is of that stature and of that quality. But of course, that has not happened through a fault of history by which he was condemned in the 13th century, 4 centuries after his death. So he's been more or less excised from the tradition, which means that we have a tradition in which his work never has had a place. So part of what I'm trying to do is see what would change if we do give it a place. His view of nature is to nuance the dichotomy of creator and creation and give us what he calls 4 forms of nature that depict a movement of procession and return, not unlike Aquinas, actually. He's been accused of pantheism, but to me that, in the course of my own project, has increasingly come to be seen as a misnomer and even an irrelevant term, which I have then replaced with the term thinking nature. Because what I think he is doing is what I call thinking nature, by which I mean encountering nature in thought, rather than thinking about nature in the sense of instrumentalizing nature. Right? I should clarify that Eriugena's notion of natura, as he calls it, is rather unique. more dynamic than that of Origen and Aquinas, in the sense that he sees God as a part of nature. He defines nature as everything that is and that is not, and includes God, according to the tradition of negative theology that you also find in Aquinas, as what is not, because God transcends being, right? But it's interesting that God is a part of nature, and yet he's a part that cannot be understood of nature. But it leads to a very integrated sense of the universe, and it's that sense of integration that I've really wanted to preserve as something that I think you can think along Christian lines. The point of God's immanence to nature is not to cancel out his transcendence then in any way, and that is important. Because some of his thought was received in the 12th century, where it again played a role, but in a somewhat different way, with some more tensions and some risks by which that sense of integratedness became fragmented, became broken. And here I want to sketch for you two poems by a 12th century author, Allen of Lille, who first wrote a poem, The Plaint of Nature, which I think is an interesting metaphor even for what we've been discussing. In Allen of Lille's Plaint of Nature, you have a personified nature who is in distress. It's a woman in distress. And there's a poem who sees this woman and tries to find out who she is and what causes her distress. She reveals herself as nature. She's beautifully dressed, and the poet describes her garments. All of creation is represented on her dress, but precisely where human nature is supposed to be represented, there's a big tear in her garment, right? And that explains, as the woman who is nature tells her story, that it's humanity who's violated her, right? And that leads to some tense sessions in the poem, whereby there's a threat of nature to excommunicate human nature. So compared to Eriugena, you see this wholeness of nature being broken up almost, and human nature really seen as the perpetrator and nature as the victim. After this poem, Allen of Lille wrote a second poem called the Anti-Claudianus. The term is a little irrelevant, the title, but it refers to an earlier classical poem, Claudianus, and he wrote a counter poem. It's generally seen as more positive by literary scholars, but I see it as more negative. So I want to explain. In that poem, he takes off where he picks up where he left off. Nature is now totally disgusted with humanity, and she wants to create a new man. And she goes about creating a new man, and she gets all the liberal arts together, and together they can provide good education. She's able to sort of get the elements together so she can make a body and all that. But she does need the chariot of the liberal arts to ascend upwards and to go to God to get a soul. So they do that, and with the help of faith and theology, they get a soul. There's a new man, and a golden age arrives on earth. Right? Now, I see that poem as more negative for various reasons. Even literarily, you can say, because the new man is kind of boring. He doesn't seem to really get off the ground. There's something disembodied about him. But the poem, I should say, was a tremendous success, and of course people saw the new man as Christ. But I think the problem really is that the beginning situation of the poem is really that the tension between humanity and nature that made the success of the Plaint of Nature has not been resolved. That has been instead been ruptured. And so the new man is really a new Adam, in fact, I would say, more than a new Christ, despite all the readings that we have of the new Christ. And so the old poem, I think, has much more to speak for itself in that it counsels us to really resolve the tensions between nature and human nature. And the interesting story, actually, that I followed in some of my work is that theological message of Alan of Lille, who was one of the great theologians at the time, wrote a book, The Rules of Theology, was not received any longer in the field of theology, because the field of theology after the 12th century switched to scholasticism, which didn't really have a place for the poetic voice of theology. So interestingly, Alan of Lille was received by Chaucer and literary scholars in the vernacular, Jean de Meun and other Romance scholars in Romance languages, but not in theology. And it's that message that I feel, coming out of that Eugenian tradition, we should actually make heard today. So in my own work, to come to that then, I want to try and restore the connection between theology and poetic ways of thinking as doing justice to a kind of an integrity of nature to which the divine is immanent, right? And that means for me that I attach a great deal of weight to what I call give nature a chance to speak for itself. Not have all kinds of ventriloquisms that speak for nature, but to have nature speak for itself and to make ourselves attuned to listening to nature. I want to allow for a way of engaging with nature that does not limit itself to instrumentalizing nature only, but see nature itself as a divine ally, someone who's an emissary of the divine and can speak on behalf of the divine. And I also want to encourage us to pay attention to nature then in another way, and see it as an instance, a divine instance that can disclose or reveal to us a divinely suffused reality. One of the tasks I see at hand, as a task at hand, is to pursue more vigorously a pre-modern theme, namely that of the parallelism of nature and scripture. That's also a theme that is pretty prominent in Eriugena, comes actually out of the Eastern tradition of Maximus the Confessor. But one of the things I foresee as a theologian, if you allow me to make that sort of conjecture, that our scriptural literacy is in decline. There's lots of text about the disappearance of I forget, the eclipse of biblical narrative by Hans Frey and other texts. I think scriptural literacy is in decline. I'm not sure it will be restored in the same way, but on this premise of a parallelism of nature and scripture, I think we should turn to nature as a way to rethink our Christian identity, and also as a way possibly for interreligious dialogue. So I think nature has a theological role that has not been explored until this day. And to conclude then, I want to bring up 2 points that I think may bear on the current discussion today. So one is, what does a more respectful attitude towards nature mean for humanity and human actions vis-a-vis nature, right? The second question is, how can we allow nature to speak, which seems essential to preserve its ambassadorial role, and how can we facilitate a culture of listening to nature, right? And third, and this may be the most dicey comment, how can we then factor in the role of technology, given, and I go back to the very beginning of my comments, that humanity's role as imago Dei also seems to presuppose a kind of co-creatorship of humanity, right? How can we do justice to that co-creatorship of humanity and at the same time make sure that the technological interventions that we place do not occur to the detriment of the integrity of nature. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Again, I just ask you if you have urgent questions right now.
Sex is... This one? Yeah. The Grammar of Sex is not a text by Allen. It's a book by John Solkowski, who's a literary historian at Harvard, about Allen. So it's not a text by Allen. But Allen uses a lot of sexual innuendo. I tend to think that we're more Freudian than the Middle Ages. So I don't think that when sexual metaphors are used, it's always about sex. So I actually don't think it's a prevalent... I mean, it's definitely there in Allen, but I don't think it is about sex. I mean, this was a text for schoolboys, and, it had to be entertaining to some extent. So there's a lot of sexual references there, and as you said, grammatical irregularity is connected with sexual irregularity, etc. But I really think it's a theological text about nature. That is the narrative, and he never lets go of that. So that would be, yeah. But maybe one more thing that I didn't really say, so the turn of theology to, say, scholasticism, I actually do see that as a big problem, however much I think it was needed and so on. And that makes somehow our modern theology sometimes more aligned with technological discourse than with the pre-modern theology, where it was more focused on salvation or return to the divine. And I feel we need to kind of recapture some of that pre-modern dynamics. And at the same time, I don't want to let go of technology, but make sure that those two are somehow in sync.
More humanized and making human more deified.
This is Athanasius of Alexandria, and on the incarnation of the Word, and it's God became human so that humans become deified. The notion of theosis is sort of his idea. But what I mentioned is that he lives as in what I call this sort of pre-temporal world. So he's not naive. He realizes that with the resurrection of Christ, not everybody's immediately immortal and won't die. But the sense was that the definitive victory, say, had been wrought by Christ's resurrection. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, I think we have a lot to discuss with the first two papers here already at the panel, but before we enter that, I think we want to hear yet another perspective. And let me introduce to you Jeffrey Bishop, who is the Tenet Endowed Chair in Healthcare Ethics, Professor of Philosophy and Professor of Theology at St. Louis University. Again, we have this rare combination of an MD and, in this case, a PhD, one from the University of Texas and a PhD from the University of Dallas. So Jeffrey Bishop's scholarly work is focused on the historical, political, and philosophical conditions that underpin contemporary medical and scientific practices and theories. He has written on diverse topics from transhumanism and enhancement technologies to clinical ethics consultation and medical humanities. He is the author of the much praised and acclaimed book, The Anticipatory Corpse, Medicine, Power, and the Care of the Dying, and currently working on another book with colleagues Therese Lysott and Andrew Michel, titled Chasing After Virtue, Neuroscience, Economics, and the Biopolitics of Morality. So I don't have your title here, so you will give it to us, and yours is the floor.
So I was neglectful in getting my title. My title is on the being of humans and the being of technology. And I just want to tie together a few things. So Hille responded to my book in a journal article that I got to respond to, and actually the title for the next book I'm working on is called Conjuring the Transhuman Gods, or Conjuring the Posthuman Gods, and it was in response to Hille's response to my book that I thought of this title and thought of the book idea. So I want to say a few things about the way I think about technology and science. I see technology as primarily a cultural, it's a way of thinking. It's a cultural way of thinking. And that science, sorry scientist, Stephen's going to go apoplectic on me for a moment, but science is its handmaiden. And I want to pick up on something Stephen said to kind of bring into relief. He's already ready to. I wanted to pick up on something that Stephen said about where this brave new world goes. This is actually from, in a non-ironic, non-critical sort of way, from the transhumanist FAQ. The transhumanism yearns to reach intellectual heights as far above any current genius as humans are above other primates, to be resistant to disease and impervious to aging, to have unlimited youth and rigor, to exercise control over their own desires, moods, and mental states, and to be able to avoid feeling tired, hateful, or irritated about petty things, to have an increased capacity for pleasure, love, artistic appreciation, and serenity, to experience novel states of consciousness that current human brains cannot access. Okay, so this is a contemporary view of what transhumanism is. Okay, so some very popular contemporary thinkers have argued that because technology is evolving at a rate faster than human moral evolution, we must intervene technologically upon the human brain to make people more moral, or in their genome. The story goes something like this. Human psychology evolved over thousands of years. Science and technology have dramatically changed our living conditions and result in large changes that have accelerated the evolutionary timescale in terms of our knowledge about the world, and with that knowledge, the ability to change the world. However, the timescale for human psychological and moral evolution remains stuck at the rate of human reproduction. Given the grave danger to our way of life due to the mismatch in the time scale between cognitive and technological evolution on the one hand, and the poorer and slowly moving psychological and moral evolution on the other, and given that cognitive enhancements places so much power in the hands of this primitive human ape that we are, and given that it is easier to destroy than to create, there is a moral imperative for humans to bioenhance themselves morally. Examples might be weapons of mass destruction, and if we're accelerating with all the cognitive abilities we have. Once we have cognitive enhancement, we'll be able to destroy the world. And if we aren't morally enhanced at the same level, we might actually do it. We'll create the proverbial mad scientist, right? And so they have this vision that they will be able to tweak either the genome or the brain in some way. And unless you think that's a bit far-fetched, I'll try to give a quick example. So let's take the example of the correlation between a polymorphism in the promoter region of monoamine oxidase A, okay, and antisocial personality disorder. So if you have this polymorphism, you are statistically more likely to be diagnosed with antisocial personality disorder. Not only that, you will, if we do fMRI scan of people's brains while they're being presented with scary faces that look threatening, the amygdala fires very rapidly, almost out of control. All right, and the cingulate gyrus does not put the brakes on the amygdala. Okay, the amygdala is fight or flight. All right, and the cingulate gyrus is part of the frontal lobes, and it puts the brakes on it. So it seems that if you have this polymorphism in the promoter region of monoamine oxidase A, you're statistically more likely to have antisocial personality disorder and to see these changes in the brain. So it goes from from gene to brain to behavior, or so the story goes. It turns out that not everybody who has the polymorphism shows these changes in their brain or in their behavior. So The thinkers who want to think about, so the idea is that, okay, we'll be able to put little nanomachines in people's brains to modulate the cingulate gyrus, right? To put the brakes on the amygdala so they don't fire off like antisocial personality disorder patients do, or people with that do, okay? That's the idea. We need to morally enhance people by intervening on the genes that constitute morality or the brains that contribute to it. So these thinkers are called Persson and Savalescu, but they do not describe this particular genetic scenario. However, they imagine that we could do a number of things to prevent this sort of immoral behavior of antisocial personality, let's say. We could screen and remove embryos that have the polymorphism as a means of preventing impulsive immoral behaviors. One can imagine a neuromodulator machine, a moral bioenhancer machine, to take over the functions of the poorly functioning cingulate gyrus. Put differently, because technological evolution is so far outrunning human moral evolution, we must engage in designer evolution in order for the human to keep up. Let's now look at a philosopher of technology called Bernard Stiegler. He begins his book, Technics and Time, by noting 3 movements in Western philosophy that shape our thinking about the kind of thing that technology is. What is the being of technology? First, he draws our attention to Plato's distinction between episteme and techne, and thus the distinction between philosophy and sophistry, which sets the epistemological trajectory of Western philosophy in motion, making techne and the technical arts merely instrumental, an instrument of sophistry. Second, Aristotle's distinction between natural and technical beings having their own motion within themselves, and technical objects having their source of motion from outside themselves. This distinction sets in trajectory the Western thinking on ontology, such that technical objects are imagined as inert, relying solely on the intentions of the human actor or the human animal for their motion. Third, Lamarck introduces the distinction between living and non-living beings on the grounds that living beings are organized and distinct from non-living beings, even those that have mechanical motion. In mainstream Western way of thinking, technical objects are more like rocks than they are like living beings, which are organized in order to some end. This is a quote from Stiegler. Lodged between mechanics and biology, a technical being came to be considered a complex of heterogeneous forces. Technical beings or technical systems look more like organized beings, according to Stiegler. In other words, they're closer to being kind of like living beings. In fact, Stiegler, especially if you think about the way machines have a certain kind of automaticity to them, they kind of enact certain things for us. With machine learning, the idea is that they will learn from the world and be able to change their behaviors accordingly, so they become more and more like living beings in that way. This is not just a point about technology. In fact, Stiegler draws on the work of André Leroy-Gourand, I'm sorry, my French is terrible. The French paleoanthropologist who notes that the thumb and the use of tools developed prior to the development of the frontal lobes. In other words, it might have been the fact that tools were used that permitted the development of the frontal lobes and allowed humanoid species to emerge. In other words, before the frontal lobes, the seat of human intentionality, there exist tools that are already being used. So evolutionarily, we do not move from consciousness to reasoning and to abstract thought to the creation of technology, but the other way around. The human animal is by nature culture. Human evolution proceeds by means other than mere biology. Life, he concludes, evolves by means other than life. In other words, the humanoid species that did not have a fully developed frontal lobes actually would reach for a tool and be able to beat back the animal, which maybe gave them some sort of survival benefit that allowed them to evolve into the kinds of thinking beings that we are today. So what does he mean by life evolving by means other than life? He says that there are 3 inheritances. This is still Stiegler. There is a genetic inheritance, certainly, a history embedded in the genome itself. In addition, a person has her own personal history stored in her hippocampus, her lived memory. The memory of this inheritance he calls an epigenetic inheritance, or an epigenetic history. And he uses epigenetic in a slightly different way than most people use it today in these talks. It is the memory of her lived experience. Yet, he says, there is yet a third one, another history, an epiphylogenetic history, the history that exists outside of her, in memory supports, in technology, in books, for instance. So technology transmits the epiphylogenetic history. Before we recorded our writing with quills and ink, humans memorized their stories, rhyme and meter serving as memory aids, a technical way to remember large volumes of information. The epic poem, to this day, I still think, twinkle, twinkle, little star, V is equal to IR. Voltage is equal to amperage times resistance. That's the only way I can ever remember that equation when I was in physics, okay? Rhyme and meter are techniques by which we memorize large amounts of information. The epic poems of the West, like Homer's Iliad and Virgil's Aeneid or Dante's Divine Comedy, were memorized and performed. People were capable of memorizing large volumes of poetry. But once we had more reliable writing techniques and materials that would last longer, the written word took precedence over the spoken word and the memorized word. Once the printing press comes along, then the computer, our abilities to memorize great swaths of text begins to fall by the wayside. And culture itself had to change due to the printing press. Even the church would have to change due to this piece of technological evolution, the printing press. Literary culture is only possible because of the printing press. Technology as memory support shapes our understanding of our own past. Moreover, the technologically powerful tell the stories. They produce the movies, shape what we remember about ourselves. Or you can think of photographs of your mother or your childhood, pieces of technology. They help you to remember your past. Or think of Facebook, throwing up memories for you, reminding you of past events in your life that you might have actually forgotten about. And it might even remind you of a past that isn't even that important to you. So now this piece of technology, Facebook, shapes what we will remember and what we will carry forward with us. Technologies serve as memory supports for our history, our past, which in turn shape how we imagine our present and our future lives. But it is not my own history, except insofar as it has been given to me through the memory supports of technology. And this is a quote now from Siegler. Therefore, there is no relation to time without artificial memory supports. The memory of the existence of the generations that preceded me and without which I would be nothing is bequeathed on such supports. This is the memory of past experience, of past epigenesis, that are not lost, contrary to what occurs in strictly biological species. In other words, artifacts and tools also influence human evolution through non-biological ways or through epiphylogenetic means. Cultural artifacts shape evolution. Techniques, whether in the form of the technical object, a book perhaps, or a metered piece of poetry, or Facebook, enable human projects by giving them a starting point and also a meaning and purpose to which the human begins to align her own life. In other words, the human animal is the animal that by nature is cultured. Yet, techniques not only support the history of human being, they also shape the future. For Heidegger, it is the future of my own death that focuses my attention on what is important. Imagine if, as you are sitting here listening to me, you get a text from your medical doctor saying, "Call me, it's urgent." Suddenly, the possibility of something bad showing up on the test that you had last week becomes really important to you, and suddenly I become really boring, which I probably am before. So whatever is on your schedule for tomorrow will be forgotten because you will focus on that point. It shapes what you imagine is possible for your future. So the point is that while one has a history, not of one's own making, in light of the future of one's own death, according to Heidegger, one is able to construct an authentic form of existence and to build into the future those things that now seem much more important in light of the fact that you're going to die. In contemplating one's death as the end of one's own time, one is enabled to pick out the most important dimensions of one's life, bringing them to the forefront of one's intentions, one's actions, and one's projects. For Stigler, our future is also technologically mediated. It's not just the history, the past that's technologically mediated. It is the future as well. Technology sets the temporal horizon. Technology is thought to be on an endless trajectory, open-ended, perpetual innovation. Just as a specific tool, say something as simple as a spear, a tool like a spear in a hunting culture is the object around which memory coalesces and stories are told, so also does the spear anticipate future hunts, future projects, future quests. So technology, according to Stigler, also sets the horizon of the future, not by drawing human attention to the end of my time, but rather deferring the end of time. Technology as a system establishes a temporal horizon through its permanent innovation. Moreover, Stigler argues because of the drive of permanent innovation in contemporary technology, we do not have time to build our cultures around the stable form of technology. So he has this thesis that technology shifts and then the human gets a little bit of freedom around that shift in technology and begins to be able to create and do things with technology, shifting culture. He says, but because technology is changing so fast, right, we never have time to catch up culturally. So he puts it this way, technics outruns ethnics. Stigler notes that permanent innovation results in a divorce, if not between culture and technics, at least between the rhythms of cultural evolution and the rhythms of technological evolution. There is no horizon of death to help us determine what is important. Things are moving so fast, advancing so fast that we do not have time to accommodate them. They are growing faster than we can match them. With constant innovation, I do not think so much about my death at the end of time. Rather, with the idea of permanent innovation in technology, I might even live forever. Even if we today do not imagine living forever literally in this bodily existence, there are those that imagine that we will live forever in a large mainframe computer in the sky, in silicon body rather than a computer body. Technology is a dynamic of permanent innovation, infinitely deferring death. We now return to person and Savulescu that I spoke of in the beginning. Whereas it used to be that the human was once thought to be a biological being, a natural being, a created being, who created her culture as a means to carry forward her past into the future, to pass along to her friends and her family her own identity, a human identity, we now find ourselves in a different situation. The human imagines herself so frail in a world moving so fast that she may not survive, that she must now offload her morality onto a machine, and machines that seem to have their own automaticities, their own tendencies and intentionalities, and possibly with machine learning, a kind of machine agency. So whereas the human used to inscribe into her artifacts and tools and machines to carry her own memory forward into her future, now she, the living being, becomes the raw material for the machines to inscribe onto their biological materials the machine's own notions of will. And the technological will to power was made flesh, put into my flesh, and dwelt among other machines. This is a very different metaphysical worldview than that where the Word, which was from the beginning, was made flesh and dwelt amongst humankind. I'll stop there.
Thank you.
All right. So what I would say is that we already see that medical technologies have shaped the way we think about our dying. It used to, I mean, at age 52, I'm 52 right now, I would have 1 foot in the grave, possibly, given the mortality rates, and I would have been presented with death and dying a lot during my life. And so the shifts are so subtle, and so we don't even recognize a shift has happened. It's at this point you can't imagine that in 20 years that we might be in that position. But at the same time, there are people who are working in biogerontology who actually think that we will be able to extend the human life to 300, 400, 500 years in the next 40 to 50 years. Okay, these are real technological optimists. And so there won't be this gradual shift. There'll be this probably, they think it's going to be, because knowledge is increasing exponentially, they believe that in fact, it will be a sudden change. And this is Stiegler's point, is that, well, we can't catch up as a culture. We can't even begin to imagine these possibilities. So the changes were always somewhat gradual. I guess with major technological evolutions, there would be a sudden change. I think maybe the Industrial Revolution might be one where there was a slight, over a short period of time, suddenly machines, and then people started moving from agrarian societies into cities very rapidly. And so I think we can see these major shifts in history, and we can probably learn something from it. But I think we're at a point where these things are going so fast. I think they're overly optimistic, to be honest, but they really believe this. Sorry.
Thank you very much for the talk. So this is just to the group, and I think it touches on some of the issues you just raised. It could just be an Imago Dei question, but I'm going to read because I wrote some things. So there's a very troubling question underneath a lot of the discussions here, and that has to do with the place within Christianity, at least, of bodily health, medical advance, etc. So there's a sociologist, Brian Turner, who talks about this medicalization of the body, and carded medical practices and regimes of power taking over the church's emphasis on practices on diet and asceticism. There's also the work by Peter Harrison about the fall and the rise of modern science as a response to the fall. So this notion of the curse in Christianity has seemed to disappear. Okay, I'm wrapping it up now quickly. So I think this is a much more difficult question, because we might want to say, oh sure, there's no problem here. Obviously health stuff is just way better. Medicine's great, this is obvious, yeah? But the thing is, from a spiritual point of view, it's not so obvious, because is that going to put us in a position, superior position to people 500 years ago in relation to God or whatnot? I don't think we can say that. So I think there's something unnerving lurking here as to how we're supposed to judge this stuff from a theological perspective. And last point here, I think some of it has to do with the issue of the growth of the soul in antiquity. So now we think the body, how am I going to phrase this? There was, the good of the soul now is something just like the accumulation of more experiences. Yeah? And that gets us into this thing of anxiety about the body, because we need to perpetuate the body so we can have more and more experiences. I think the thing in ancient and more classic understanding of the growth of the soul towards virtue, which is a teleology there, which gives you a way in which you could die early and still have completed, have lived a good life. So there's one question there. I don't know if you have thoughts about the latter thing. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Who wants to respond first? I think you all three need to respond, actually.
You asked very good questions here with that. There's a lot in them. But I think in terms of health, I think there is a big question in what do we mean looking at the theological tradition when we think about health, right? Because I think the problem is we've had a change in how we understand health. From, you go to antiquity, it's kind of a certain kind of balance of humors, things like that, to modern medicine, classical modern medicine, which is just response to disease, which has been critiqued a lot for good reasons. And then we get to now, which is health is the minimization of risk, which minimization of risk is an impossible and infinite task. So I think we've shifted how we understand health, and that is leading to a lot of our problems that we're seeing across a number of these issues.
I'll say one thing. I mean, there's so many questions there that I will say that there's a group out there who call themselves Christian transhumanists group that actually sees technology as a gift from God, that we will then implement those gifts in order to effect all of the stuff that God has promised in the resurrection, including we will effect the resurrection through technology. Many of them believe that. So that there's that strand of Christianity that is out there, and so I think that any notion of the fall is sort of subsumed in the coming of Christ, and they see that very much as Christ having set off a trajectory that we see ever more unfolding in a sort of evolutionary pattern towards this sort of God-likeness. So I think in that version of Christianity, the fall has already been overcome, and it's just a matter of attaining to the promises that God has made. And technology is the means of doing that. I don't know what it means to do with traditional understandings. I think I'd have to sit and think about that for a little bit longer. One other thing about your point about nature, I think that's a very good point. I think human nature we've forgotten about it as a thing anymore, because there's no distinction between therapy and enhancement, because we no longer have a notion of human nature, that we can return it to a certain kind of functioning. And I think it's gone away, but I wonder if it's gone away because we've chased it off. We've constrained nature in the way that you're saying, and we no longer let our own body speak to us. So I'd like to hear you reflect on that.
Thank you. Well, I actually wanted to make a comment on the soul. That's okay. Not immediately on the body. Maybe one aside, because you were talking about transhumanism. There is a study on Augustine called Once Out of Nature by Andrea Nightingale, who says that Augustine, Adam and Eve in paradise for Augustine were transhumanists, and so she sees paradise as a transhuman place. It's very complicated. I totally disagree, but I think retroactively some of these terms will inform how texts are going to be interpreted. So that's a whole other matter. But as to your point, I think the ascetic life has disappeared from the West mostly, but certain themes like discernment, I think, are very important, and I think increasingly with biotechnology, that's where we need to go. I'm not sure we can regulate everything, make policies for everything. It will be individual discernment sometimes, what you feel you can or cannot accept. I'm not sure that's a satisfactory answer, but I do think that that's an important quality in which we should be trained in a way. Yeah.
Can I say something about freedom on this point? Because I discernment that's a good word. The problem is that technologies have become so ubiquitous and such that I could discern for myself. Yeah. But the culture of technology, it's so pervasive that there's nothing to push back against. It's just there. So I think we're in a way losing freedom over against these cultures of ensnaring ourselves with technology.
Yeah. In the name of freedom.
In the name of freedom.
Well, and if I could just add on that freedom, I mean, Gaiman and I would agree, I think, in the background that we're both coming out of a Foucauldian perspective where the fundamental way that power operates is shaping how you use your freedom and the paradigm through which you use your freedom. And that, I think, is what we're seeing now, is we're shaping to think of our freedom in terms of picking different technological options to assume ends.
Thank you. Yeah, no, I'm not going the route of Bacon. I mean, I've really focused more on what I see in the medieval sense of nature, to which the divine is really immanent. I've also explored someone like Ralph Waldo Emerson, who writes a lot about nature and who has actually simultaneously, I think he was quite enamored of science also, but both the scientific and the poetic as not at odds with each other. And that is where I would really like to go, because I don't think I want to stop or in any way technological development, if I even could, which I can't. But I think it should not come at the exclusion of having a poetic relationship with nature. And I think our paradigms are so exclusionary, right? You're doing one thing or the other. I find that actually a problem to begin with. I mean, you're either scholastic or you're a mystic, right? Why can't you be both? So I think it's a matter almost of epistemological paradigms too. So my idea would be to try and work simultaneously with both paradigms. Sorry? Yeah. Yeah.
So I would say, for that one point about Bacon, there are also many points where he talks about coercing nature to release her secrets and to let things go.
It's more of a vexing than an coercing.
Okay, well, still, it's a constraining of nature in a way. So I actually think science does that. I think science controls experiments, and you kind of create artificial conditions so that you can figure out the one active thing that you do. And I want to pick up on a point that Gaiman made, and Gaiman's point was that, nature or life tends to conform to the constraints up to a point that we put on it, right? So only certain kinds of things come into relief, certain kinds of statements that we can make come into relief by virtue of having controlled it, constrained it, to do what we think it might be able to do. So in that sense, then there is a kind of listening, but it's already a listening that says that nature is going to speak only because I have constrained it in a certain way. So I think that what we've done is we've moved away from a kind of descriptive biology or a kind of looking at things in relation to other things, right? Rather than looking at constraining or finding the one control or the one variable that we don't control or we control all of the others. So I think the relatedness or the relational dimension of it is completely lost, and that's what I would say is important.
I didn't mention it because I actually want to sort of push that more to the background. I actually think that the whole stewardship model is responsible for some of the excesses and the abuse of nature. So I see my own model as a more comprehensive model in which there still might be a place for some kind of stewardship, but it's not the only model that is out there. And I think, especially in the Protestant world, it has been the dominant model. Yeah.
And for Professor Bishop,
I think the futurists kind of have different versions of what this looks like, and they might say, oh, we could bring any one of these or multiple of these versions into being. And so it might be that we are one big collective consciousness in the mainframe computer or some artificial intelligence that's developed consciousness. It could be that we're able to, Paul and I will still be able to have our conversations and our discussions, through the machines. So, I mean, it sounds far-fetched, it sounds crazy, but these are really, really smart people who are speculating on these things. And so it's almost, when you say them, they sound so silly that you don't even want to say them. But they're smart, and sometimes there's just technical hurdles to get over. And so it's multiform in the way they're thinking about it.
Yeah, I mean, I think there is a kind of wonder at nature that's called forth, and that could serve as a response to some of these problems. But I think there's also what many have called the technological sublime, which is like wondering at our abilities and all the cool, neat stuff you can do. I mean, we got to build a hydrogen bomb because it's so sweet, as the scientists said, right?
Or glow-in-the-dark pigs,
Yeah.
to see if we can get the genes to move around,
Yeah. I would say that the transhumanists, if you actually read how they view their immortality, it's generally a rapidification of experiences and a move from one kind of form of life to another. So they want to speed up experience as much as possible, which I think is kind of the exact inverse of the classical Christian model of contemplation, which is dwelling in the eternal moment with God, right, in that relationship. So, I mean, I think it's almost the exact kind of opposite, is the speeding up versus the kind of the dwelling in the now. Now, I think there is also kind of it's also different from the kind of narcosis effects of a lot of the technologies we use right now, too.